I'm sure you've heard this, that it's been said that blood is thicker than water. Now, that rather interesting platitude would suggest that family ties, even though they are frequently strained and tried, are stronger than any other relational bonds which might be formed. Now, this is simple proverbial wisdom, so to speak. After all, no judge would allow the sibling of a defendant to sit on the jury that is empowered to impartially try him or her. And which of us would not suspect a miscarriage of justice if just such a situation would be allowed? Even if the verdict were to go against the defendant in such a case, it might just suggest that there was severe animosity or hostility between the siblings. For as many of us have observed, when the strong family ties are broken, they are often the most difficult to repair. And that serves, in a sense, as the prologue to the intense and profound drama that we have unfolding in tonight's parashah, which Rabbi Jason so very nicely began unfolding for us, and I will build on those wonderful thoughts. Joseph is Israel's favorite son, and here he is sitting in judgment on his brothers. Now, these same brothers had many years earlier sold him into slavery as a jealous response to their father's privileged treatment of him. Through many years of hardship, God has elevated Joseph to a position of authority, ruler over all of Israel, second only to Pharaoh himself. Now, his position is a reward, as far as Pharaoh is concerned, for his God-given wisdom, insight, and vision that saved not only Egypt, but also the surrounding nations from the deadly results of the great famine. After correctly interpreting Pharaoh's dreams, Joseph had urged the ruler to prepare for 7 years of famine during the 7 years of prosperity. At this point, we raise a couple questions. How could he have known that his own brothers would seek audience before his throne in an effort to purchase just that food to sustain the lives of themselves and their father and their youngest brother Benjamin? And secondly, how could they, the brothers, have known that the great man who controlled their very lives was their very brother whom they had betrayed a lifetime ago? Those are the questions hanging out there for us as this text unfolds. Now, at first glance, it seems somewhat odd that they would not recognize Joseph. But remember, it was a boy after all, well, perhaps a teenager, 17 or so, which the sons of Jacob had sold to a passing caravan, not a fully matured man. Before them now stood a middle-aged, let's say cosmopolitan Egyptian, not a young nomadic Hebrew. His clothes would have been the soft robes of wealth and of royalty, not the coarse clothes of a shepherd. His soft skin and shaved face would never have betrayed his true heritage, that of a Hebrew shepherd. Quick aside, the term Hebrew I'm using technically, because prior to our return to the land of Canaan, we were still wandering through the land of Canaan, hence we were called Habiru, or wanderers. After we got there, we became Israelites, or Israelis. Back to the story. Now, the context in which Joseph is reunited with his brothers is one that none of them could ever have imagined, if they even dared to bring him back to the front of their suppressed memories, if they could even imagine that he might still in some way be alive. Yet, as the text indicates for us, Joseph remains their brother. The family ties are not dependent on their recognition or acknowledgement of him. Joseph, like them, is a son of Israel and has been chosen by God to be their deliverer and not their judge. It's not surprising that they fear him then more when he reveals himself to them as their forgotten brother than when he was disguised before them as a foreign ruler. And this suspicion does not pass away easily, as next week's Parshah will show us. Because years after, as that text points out, after the death of Jacob, they still fear his vengeance, and so they appeal to him for continued mercy. And we find out next week he assures and consoles them. He says, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me," he says, "but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So don't be afraid," he says, "I will provide for you. What you intended for evil," he says, "God intended for good." Let's remember that in our lives as well. Back to the story. Now, in a strange paradox of sorts, Joseph, the deliverer of Israel, is hidden among the Gentiles and becomes their salvation as well. But some 400 years later, as we will find out in a couple weeks, when the new Pharaoh forgets Joseph and oppresses the children of Israel, the God of Israel will break the back of Egypt. Egypt, as in one sense the prototypical nation, learns that you cannot receive blessing from the God of Israel if you do not honor the children of Israel, in accordance with Genesis 12:3. Another strange ambivalent relationship exists here, and it's an answer to the question, as this audience takes place, why is it Judah that steps forward? Why not Reuven, the firstborn, or Shimon, or Levi, who come next? Why is it Yehuda or Judah that steps forward? Well, please remember, as Rabbi Jason reminded us, it was Judah years before who had devised the plan to fake Joseph's death and to sell him into slavery. Now, he did this to prevent his brothers from killing Joseph. And it's also Judah who becomes the protector now of Benjamin, offering himself in slavery so the youngest of Jacob's sons might be spared. Now, the situation here is extremely tense. After having nearly brought their father to his death with their sale of Joseph, they dared not contemplate returning home to Jacob without Rachel's other or only other son. Judah had promised his father that he would be responsible for his father's youngest, and so he steps forward and he speaks to the one second in command of Pharaoh. What shall we say to my Lord? What shall we speak? How shall we justify ourselves, he says. Chapter 44 and verse 16. God has found out the sins of your servants. Behold, we will be my Lord's servants, both we and also the one in whose hand the goblet was found. And that's toward the end of last week's portion. Judah recognizes the sins here of the brothers. A continuation of a theme that was first expressed by the Grand Prince of Egypt when he originally confronted them with the charge that they were spies. And their response back then, if you recall, chapter 42, was, we are guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw his distress and we would not hear, therefore his distress has come upon us. 42 verse 21. Now Judah's present words to the great prince are the culmination of this theme. The brothers behaved terribly toward Joseph, and now they must pay the price. Judah's offer that the brothers become slaves to the ruler of Egypt, because God has, as he says, found out the iniquity of your servants. That is a clear expression of Judah's conviction that they must all accept the harsh reality that they are being punished for the sale of Joseph. And collective slavery, he suggests, is preferable to returning home to Jacob without Benjamin. But the great prince of Egypt shifts the tables on Judah here. He rejects the offer of all the brothers becoming servants. He only wants Benjamin. Now this is when Judah grows confused. According to his calculations, the brothers' troubles were the result of the evil they had perpetrated against their brother. An act so cruel that long after they had buried the past, God himself had reawakened it. The way Judah surmised it, since the brothers had sinned as a collective unit, they must suffer as a collective unit. But Joseph's singling out Benjamin as the only brother who would be enslaved challenged Judah's perception. After all, Benjamin had never been part of the conspiracy against Joseph. He was too young. If any of the brothers were innocent, Benjamin was innocent. Why should he be the only one punished? Why should the innocent one suffer? Oh, by the way, all the way through, there's some wonderful images here that I don't have time to unravel for you. I'll let you think about them, or take a look at the YouTube version, or listen to the MP3 version as you unravel them. Judah says at this point, something must have gone wrong. Reminds me of a newspaper headline. This is a real newspaper headline. It says, something went wrong in jet crash, expert says. Thank you for that Very enlightening information. Something had gone wrong. Now we can understand why last week's portion ends precisely where and when it does. It has little to do with the desire to create suspense, but creating suspense was not beyond or above the rabbis as they divided up these sections. It had to do largely with Judah's newfound awareness, which then becomes emphasized here. So this week's portion opens with the words, "Then Judah stepped near to him and said, O my Lord, let your servant, I pray you, speak a word in your ears." Now, until this point, remember, Judah had believed that the grotesque nightmare that they were experiencing was the result of God's punishment. Judah now realizes that cannot be the case. It appears he begins to perceive the unfolding trail of evidence that casts a new light on the prince's true identity. He recalls that Shimon, the brother with the most blood on his hands in the Joseph incident, was singled out to sit in prison as a hostage after their first trip to Egypt for food. He now remembers how on their second visit, the prince had arranged their seats according to their ages when he invited them for a banquet, chapter 43. Only two other people could have known the proper ages of the brothers. Father Jacob, who wasn't there, and Joseph, who was. And yes, an Egyptian, a grand prince, couldn't care less about an old Hebrew father, unless, of course, it was his old father as well. Every word of Judah's is calculated and successfully earns him the prize, the bullseye, so to speak. Joseph recognizes Judah's profound profound wisdom, maybe vision as well. Judah has now emerged as the tikkun, the repair or repairer, and thereby the most proper heir of Jacob, and in so doing becomes worthy of the birthright of Abraham. This drawing near of Judah's comes at the climax of the story of Joseph and his brothers. And to understand the story fully, we need to invoke the saying of the great Middle Ages Rabbi Ramban Nachmanides, who says, and I quote, "The deeds of the fathers are a sign for the sons. The deeds of the fathers are a sign for the sons." In other words, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob prophetically enacted the history of their descendants. Prefigured it, if you want to use that term instead. And we can see the same reality in the story of Jacob's sons, Joseph, Judah, and his brothers. Joseph is a sign to Israel that one who is rejected will become our deliverer. Joseph is the favored son, the dearly loved one of his father, just as Isaac was to Abraham, using virtually the same terminology. This is the son whom I love. If that sounds familiar to you, it ought to, for other reasons. But first, Joseph, the deliverer to come, is rejected and handed over to the Gentiles and to death, as represented by the pit and Pharaoh's dungeon. The Genesis 37 text says, "Now when they saw him, Joseph, afar off, before he came near them," notice there's that term, come near again, "they conspired against him to kill him. They said, 'Come, now let us kill him and cast him into one of these pits, and say some wild beast did this to him.'" And so, in our text, as one translation of Vayigash says, Judah steps out from among the brothers, as indicated by the opening word Vayigash. And as another understanding of that text says, and he drew near to Joseph. And he did so to offer him himself in place of Benjamin. And thereby he passed an important test. And what he said is striking. Chapter 44:27 to 34 is that text. He says, "I will bear the blame before you, my father." Interesting phrasing. I will bear their blame before you, my father. All of my life, or perhaps with my life. And then he says to Pharaoh, Please let your servant remain here as my Lord's slave in place of the boy, so that the boy can return. Offered himself, as Rabbi Jason said, as a ransom, so the other could live and return. He did that so that his father Jacob would not die, or as he says, and so bring the gray head of our father down to the grave. Offered himself in place of his brothers so that his father would not die, his life in place of another's. But there's more in our parsha, and I want to get back to the opening lines of that text. After the Vayigash Lev Yehuda Vayomer, here's what the Vayomer is what he said. Be Adoni. And then half a dozen words later, Adoni again. And then a line later, Adoni. All the way through, you have the repeat of Adoni. You'll recognize it from the related term, Adonai. Why would this term be repeated so often in the text? Once, maybe twice would be sufficient. But this is more than that in less than 2 verses. And then it continues that way. Perhaps it is answered by the phrase that ends the opening verse, Ki kamoka kefaro, because you are like Pharaoh. Now let me fill that out for you just a bit. In those days, who was Pharaoh? I don't mean what was his name. Exactly. He was God to the people of Egypt. So in effect, he says, you are like God. And therefore the Adoni becomes reinforced. And then later he says to Pharaoh, Ve'achiv mate, my brother is dead. That's interesting. In light of the response we have in the text at the end of chapter 45, as the brothers return to their father, they shout, Joseph is alive, and he is ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Jacob's response is, when he sees the evidence, it must be true. Joseph, my son, is alive. I will go and see him. Did you catch that? The one who is dead is now alive. The one who is alive now rules over the greatest empire of that time. Oh, by the way, in last week's portion, we're told further about Joseph. Chapter 41. First of all, even Pharaoh recognized that this was one who's full of the Spirit of God. Sort of echoing, or later the words of the prophets perhaps echo this. Isaiah 11, Isaiah 61, both of which form part of the background of Mechadodi. This is the one on whom the Spirit of the Lord rests. But behind the scenes of this grand drama, we find out, is a great director. And that was part of the English reading of the Parsha. But I'll get to that in a moment. First of all, in chapter 45, when Joseph reveals himself, he says, I am Joseph. But his brothers, the text says, couldn't say a word. They were so stunned with surprise. He says, come over here. So they came closer. Interesting. And the physical act prefigures the relational act that soon takes place. He says, I'm Joseph, your brother whom you sold into slavery. And now they finally recognize him. He's recognized by his brothers. Echoing another prophetic text, or actually the prophetic text echoes this, the Haftorah text, Zechariah 12, verse 10. And when he returns, they will see and receive the one who was pierced. Just like they received him initially, by the way. The beginning of Passover week, as the Gospels record. Well, anyhow, Joseph continues and says, God did it. He sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. This was to preserve your life. He goes on to say, God has sent me here to keep you and your families alive so you will become a great nation. Interesting text. Fulfilling the Abrahamic promise, the Abrahamic covenant of Genesis 12. Yes, he says, just to reinforce it, God is the one who sent me here, not you. He made me manager of this entire empire, ruler over all the land of Egypt. And unsurprisingly, as it was read in our English text, the director shows up on stage yet again. During the night, it says in chapter 46, God spoke to him in a vision. In a vision, God is speaking to him yet again. to Jacob. In keeping with chapter 28, in keeping with chapter 31, in keeping with chapter 32, God speaks to Jacob. Another quick aside, please remember this undercuts any kind of understanding of Jacob that sees him as less than a man of blessing and of devotion to God. God doesn't speak to such positively in such a fashion. Jacob is a man of real vision, if you want to turn that around a bit. He says, God does, I am God. Don't be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will see to it that you will become a great nation there. That's exactly what Joseph had said. Exactly what God promised Abraham. Now listen to this, because this prefigures what's going to happen in about 3 or 4 weeks. He said, as he describes himself as I am God, I will go with you. The meaning of the name uttered at the burning bush. And I will bring your descendants back again. In other words, all of this and all that Joseph had said and all that God had promised is God's doing. It's God's grand plan. Now, I don't have the time to get into some very striking text in chapter 46, verses 28 to 30, as Joseph and Jacob meet, because you'll find it's the mirror image of a well-known parable that Yeshua spoke, the parable of the prodigal son. I'll let you figure out those connections. They're not that difficult, but they are just that enlightening. So a strange but important relationship exists here between Joseph and Judah. It was Judah, remember, years before, who had devised a plan to fake Joseph's death and to sell him into slavery. He did this to prevent his brothers from killing Joseph. And it's also Judah who becomes the protector of Benjamin in our text, offering himself in slavery so the youngest of Jacob's sons might be spared. In other words, Judah is truly a prince among his brothers, the one whose descendants Jacob prophesies or prophetically announces in next week's text. You'll have to come back for that next week. He announces this will be the one to continue the scepter of Israel. Judah is the ancestor, therefore, of Jesse, the father of David, the prototypical king of Israel, the ancestor of the Prince Messiah, whom we anticipate through the words of Lachadodi and Yamidah. Judah is the ruler among his brothers. Joseph, on the other hand, is a ruler among the Gentiles. Initially a suffering servant for the sake of his brothers, Joseph is to Judah, if you would have it, the invisible or perhaps the unseen side of the moon, in response to the part of the moon that we see, the bright face. It's no wonder then that when the sages wished to reconcile the divergent pictures of the Messiah in Scripture, as Rabbi Jason reminded us, the lowly servant who would arrive on a donkey and the victorious king who would ride in on the clouds, these wonderful messianic predictions, as they sought to reconcile them, they looked at a strange interrelationship between Judah and Joseph. The rabbis of old conceived, therefore, of two messiahs, Mashiach ben David, the victorious Messiah, Mashiach ben Yosef, the suffering Messiah. Two messiahs, each coming once, one to suffer, one to rule. Never would they have imagined, no, perhaps they could have imagined, one Messiah who would embody both. Yeshua, Israel's greatest son, as both suffering servant and conquering king. The conquering king, in fact, the very king the wise men of centuries ago searched for at just this time of year. Which brings us to tonight's Haftorah, as it was read for you. And David, my servant, the Messiah himself, Ezekiel 37:24, shall be their king, their only shepherd, and they shall obey my laws and all my wishes. They shall live in the land of Israel where their ancestors lived. The land I gave, listen to this, not my servant Abraham, but my servant Jacob, the man of blessing, and the man of our text. They and their children after them shall live there, and their grandchildren for all generations. And my servant David, their Messiah, shall be not only their shepherd, but their prince forever. And I will make a covenant of peace with them, an everlasting pact. I will bless them and multiply them and put my temple among them again forever. And I will make my home among them. Yes, I will be their God. And the nations will know that I am the Lord. That's the Haftorah portion. By the way, that Haftorah portion was being read while those same wise men were on the road searching for just this guy. The text begins in verse 17, which was not read to you, the text of the Haftorah. The prophet Ezekiel is told to take 2 sticks and put them in his hand. And the text says those 2 sticks will become one. The text tells us they are the stick of Judah and Joseph. And they become one. Because Judah was willing to step out and draw near. And they become one, or had become one, as that little baby was born and was lying in the manger. In a thought for the day kind of thing called the Daily Motivator, here's the suggestion for this time of year. You are familiar with the fact our calendar is about to turn over into another year? Okay, good. The Daily Motivator says this: now is the time and this is the moment. All else is but a memory of what has been or a speculation of what might come. It's useful to look back and to look forward as well. And again, our text is that. Always remember, though, that now is where you are, and now is when you can make a difference. Regrets and wishes will not change what has been or what will be. Unless, of course, you're Scrooge. But then that's a different story. It is by taking action now, when you can, that you will fulfill the best of your possibilities. On this day when the calendar changes, or this weekend when the calendar changes, and you're reminded of the passage of time, remember this: whatever the month, whatever the year, now is the time for you to live. This is the moment for you to act. I might add, now is the time, like Judah, to step out, to draw near. All that you are right now. All that you can be begins in this moment. So this is a great place to be. Now is a great place to be. For when you live it fully with love, with gratitude, with purpose, with God, anything is possible. Last question from the text. Are you ready, willing, and able to step out like Judah and draw near? Take the next minute or so for a time of reflection and quiet, and a time to decide.